the economic warfare, because that's what it is, between the United States and the People's Republic of China. It is in many ways the defining struggle of our time, likely to remain so for quite a while. Not 100% clear, I mean, at least not to me, how this is going to end up. So if you thought I was going to tell you where this is going to go, I wish I could, but I can't. But I can give you some insights, I hope, into what is going on and why. Okay, I'm going to do it two different ways. The first way, I'm going to talk about the three different levels at which this war is being fought. And then we'll talk about, the winners, the losers, and all of the rest. First, the long run, the long perspective, the historical perspective. China is a rising power, an ascending economic and political powerhouse. Just a few facts for you, because these facts are crucial and should be the framework within which everything else that I say follows. Okay. The United States has roughly 325 million people. Right? China has 4 times that number of people. So we're not talking about societies that are equal. One has 4 people for every 1 person in the other one. Please, you have to keep that in your mind. Number 2, for the last 30 years, under the control, the unique control of the Chinese Communist Party, they have organized and operated a particular kind of economy. Here are the qualities to keep in mind of that economy. Number 1, whereas 40 years ago, the bulk of industry was owned and operated by the government, which in turn was dominated by the Communist Party. Over the last 40 years, a very large portion of the Chinese industrial economy was turned over to private ownership and operation. At the same time, the government's control, which remains very important and very large, was decentralized, so that some government enterprises are owned and operated by the national government, but a lot of them are owned and operated by regional or state governments and also by local, city and county governments. So when you think of the central government, no, it's a decentralized government. And the job of the central government is mostly the coordination of all of this. The relations among the government enterprises with one another, the relationship of the government enterprises to the private enterprises, the relationships among the private enterprises. The Communist Party, through the government, regulates and controls all of that. They also opened up, once the United States ended, I assume you're all aware, when the Russian Revolution happened in 1917, the United States refused to recognize them. Functioned as if there was nobody there. It was only many years later, under Roosevelt, that the government of the United States recognized the Soviet Union. Same thing happened with the Chinese Revolution in 1949. The government did not recognize them for many years, if you remember, until Nixon and Kissinger opened China up, as if they were closed before. But all that meant was they recognized them. With that recognition, the Chinese began to allow American companies, as they had done with Japanese and Europeans before, to come in. Most of the time, this is very important, most of the time they required the foreign company to be in partnership of some sort with a Chinese company, either a private one or a state one, or even a combination of all three. And a deal was struck, a deal which could not be forced on anybody by the Chinese government, and was not. Here was the deal. I'll use the example of the United States, but the same deal was made with British companies or German companies or Japanese companies. We know why you want to come to China, they said. You want to use our workers who are way cheaper than the workers in your own country. We understand that, we're not stupid. And you want access to our market because we are we're the biggest country on earth, and even though our people are average low income, we got so many of them that you can sell things. There's always been a fantasy in the West. 100 years ago, it was the fantasy, just imagine if you were a toothbrush maker, if you could be the toothbrush maker for China. All those teeth. Could you sell toothbrushes? Oh my goodness.
The lamps of China.
Yeah, it was, or the lamp, or the toilet paper, or your imagination can take it. So here's the deal that was struck. We know you want to hire our workers who are cheap, who are well-disciplined and increasingly well-educated. So they're good workers, they're hard workers, they're disciplined workers, and they're cheap. Very attractive. We know you want that. And that's fine. We'll deliver them to you. We also know you want access to the Chinese market. You want to sell into China. We have a growing market. Starting in the 1990s, they had the fastest growing market in the world, which they still do. Don't ever forget it. For the last 25 years, if you're a capitalist anywhere in the world, and if what you're concerned about is the growth of the market for whatever you produce, you've got to be in China, because that's the fastest growing demand for everything. And so the Chinese said, we know you want cheap labor, and we know you want access to our market. We will give you that. And here's what we want. You've got to give us your technology. You've got to show us the machinery. You have to share your techniques with us so that we can learn them. And there was no hiding it. We want to develop our own industry with these techniques. We want a Chinese industry to develop. We will work together with you. But that's a deal. You don't want the deal, fine. Have a nice day. But if you want the cheap labor of China, and if you want access to the Chinese market, you've got to share your technology, okay? When you hear now both the left and the right, Democrats and Republicans, telling you about intellectual property theft, that's what they mean. Here's what they want. They want Americans to have cheap labor, access to China, and give in return nada, which the Chinese say, not going to happen. Not going to happen. And so when Mr. Trump said, well, we have to have an agreement on intellectual property, the Chinese say, in Chinese, well, I won't repeat it. You're not going to get that. Okay, next, context, before we get to the punchlines. Context. This partly public, partly private capitalist, by the way, all capitalists, if by capitalist you mean the structure of an enterprise in which there's a relatively small number of people who function as the employer, and a relatively large number of people who function as the employees, such that the employer pays a wage to the employee. But all the decisions, what to produce, how to produce, what technology to use, where to produce, and what to do with the profits are made by the relatively small group of people or the employers. If that's what you mean by capitalism, and that's certainly what I mean, then both the public and the private enterprises in China were capitalist by that definition. In one case, it was government officials who were the board of directors. In another case, it was private individuals elected by shareholders. So the people were different, and how you got to be the employer was different. But you were an employer faced with employees. You paid wages, et cetera, et cetera. So you had a complicated public and private capitalist system managed by the state, strong regulation, which in turn was managed by a very well-organized, unique political organization, the Communist Party. That was China's economy. That is China's economy. All that's changed is the balance. The relative importance of the private has grown, and the relative importance of the state enterprises has shrunk. But mostly that's it. Now here's the reality. Over the last 25 years, the average annual growth of output, which we call GDP in economics, gross domestic product is what GDP stands for. the growth of the GDP, a convention used all over the world to measure how big an economy is getting, has averaged over 25 years between 6, which is low, which is what it is now, and 9%, sometimes over. Over the same period of time, the growth of the GDP of the United States has fluctuated between 2 and 3%. So let me do that again. Rate of growth of product in this country, 2 to 3% per year. Rate of growth of product in China, 6 to 9%. Do you understand? That's why they're catching up. Because they're growing faster, year in and year out. To those people around the world, and I hope it includes a lot of you in this room, who understand that for most of the people in the world who live in poor countries that have been poor one hell of a long time, the number one objective, whether you agree with it or not is not the question, but the number one objective is to stop being poor and to become comfortable, maybe even rich. If that's your goal, and that's a big one for a lot of people, then the contest between China and the rest of the world is no contest. It's over. The Chinese won. Everybody else lost. Nobody comes close. And for those of you who live in the world where these kinds of informations are somehow not available to you, in the 20th century, there was also one country that grew faster than everybody else. It was called the Soviet Union. If the 20th century fastest grower was the Soviet Union and the 21st century's fastest grower was the People's Republic of China, you ought to draw some implication from this. Something has to occur.
Why did they collapse in 92?
Good. I wish, maybe we'll devote a whole session to why they did. I wrote a book, which any of you are interested in, trying to explain. No, we did, because we felt as Marxists that we had a job to explain why that fell apart, what happened there. Because if Marxists don't explain it, then only the people who don't like Marxism will offer their explanations, and those will be different. Yeah, but it certainly did collapse, and that's an obligation for people like us to explain.
So what was your book?
It's called Class Theory and History. Published in 2002 by Routledge. It's a big British publisher. And it has a subtitle, Capitalism and Communism in the USSR. It's an attempt to explain why it developed and why it collapsed. Anyway, let's stay with what we are. Second factoid. Over the last 30 years, the average real wage of an American worker has gone nowhere, stagnant, flat, like I mentioned to you earlier. That actually goes back to the late 1970s. The real wage of an average real wage in the United States today is roughly what it was at the end of the 1970s. Over the same period of time, the average real wage of the Chinese worker quadrupled. Do you understand? Did the Chinese start from a lower level? Absolutely, much poorer. But most people measure how they're doing in relationship to their own situation. When the Chinese working class asks, how are we doing under communism? The answer is, whoopee. It's very hard for Americans. Let me do that again. Whoopee. Just the same reaction you would get from most Americans if over the last 20 years they could say, my standard of living has quadrupled. You know what that would mean? It would mean I wouldn't have to go into debt to send my kids to college, would I? I wouldn't be worrying about debts half the time, because I would have been able to afford these things without borrowing money, because my income would have allowed me to do it. Okay, so you have to have this in your mind, otherwise the rest of it you won't get. So this is a big, fat problem. The Chinese are rising. They're already the biggest country on earth, and they have managed, despite their enormous population, scrunched on relatively, they're not the biggest by geography, they're the biggest by population. Russia, for example, is much bigger geographically than China is, but has a much smaller population. So there are an awful lot of people scrunched in a small place, that lacks a lot of key resources. For example, oil and gas. One of the biggest things for China for the last 20 years, and will continue. They've got to get oil and gas from somebody else. They can't proceed without it. They're working night and day to try to figure that out. Nuclear energy, solar energy. That's why they're ahead in these areas. Their survival depends on it. If you have a solar panel on your roof, it comes from China, and the technology for sure. They have to. Okay, so the Chinese are growing very quickly. They've mastered how to grow quickly. They're the best at it. And it's not a flash in the pan because it's been going on for 30 years. Even in the face of this trade war, this year, which is a poor year for them relative to their history, is 6%. What is it this year in this country? 2.5%. What? Not even close. It doesn't take very long for poor and rich countries to pass one another when one of them is going like this and the other one is going like that. That's what you have. So the United States is facing a reality which the people in charge understand. We have a major competitor, the likes of which we have not had for a long time. And the Chinese are very, very good at many things. They have their own Google, their own Facebook. They do all of that. One of the reasons that Trump went after this company, some of you notice, Huawei, is because Huawei, utilizing what's called 5G technology, the next generation, G is just generation, 5th generation of this technology. Huawei is better at this than any American company. And there's a problem there. And they're not the only one, nor is that the only industry. The Chinese, over the last 20 years, have poured vast new resources into their university system, subsidizing huge numbers of students, particularly in areas like the STEM fields, engineering, and so forth. The United States, by comparison, is doing what? If you look at the funding of public universities in America educate 3/4 of our graduates from college. So higher education in the United States is mostly a public event. You hear about the private ones because they're the ones with the money. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and all of that. But it's the public school. And with one exception, the state of North Dakota is the one exception. All the other 49 states have been cutting the funds for public higher education. These are signs, folks. We are cutting, the Chinese are flooding. And the results are already showing up, and they will only become more extreme. So one aspect of the struggle between the United States and China is a classic example of the increasingly desperate anxiety of the declining power in the face of the rising one. It is the flip side of what the situation was, say, a century ago, when the ancient Chinese Empire was confronted by the arriving European and American armies and navies. If you ever want to read about it, one of the saddest kind of story, it's called the Boxer Rebellion. At the end of the 19th century, as the Europeans just took pieces of China away and had a war against the old imperial Chinese society, and the imperial Chinese society was in no way able to compete and took desperate efforts, including ceding large parts of their territory, particularly around the cities like Shanghai and so on, to the Europeans, who simply took chunks of the city, walled them around, and had them as European enclaves. That's where places like Hong Kong began. Britain arranged for the Chinese to give them a 99-year lease. Good timing. And that's why Hong Kong is what it is and was what it was. It only went back to China at the end of the 99 years a few years ago. And those people are used to a different arrangement, and now, as you can see, are not happy with what they have to accommodate to with the Chinese. Okay? So there's a clash here that has to be understood at that level. Here's a second one. That the United States, this is a different level of this issue. The United States has got a very complicated economic entwinement with China, right? This is different from clashing two societies. They depend on each other. This is like, imagine a horrific marriage of two people. Obviously, it's something hard for you to imagine. None of you have that, or see it, or have any feeling for that. So just imagine with me a couple that didn't get along real well, but had become what psychologists call codependent. You know, they need each other, which they can't quite face, and they hate each other, and they love each other, and what a mess. Okay, that's a good way for me to think, to ask you to think about the United States and China. Let me give you just 2 or 3 examples of the intertwinement. Over the last 40 years, the American working class could be paid way less than they otherwise would have demanded to be paid. Why? Because they could buy cheap Chinese products. You all learned when you went to TJ Maxx or Sears or Walmart or Target, or Marshall's, you know, all the places where we go to shop for clothing and appliances. We were able to buy, look, if we had an interesting experiment, and I asked you all, please stand up, take off all your clothes, and then come one by one to the front of the room. Some of you are getting horrified already, but it's just imaginary exercise. Otherwise, I'll get in trouble with the authorities here. I'm not proposing that you do it, just an imaginary. And then I asked you to come up and put over here the pile of all the clothes made in the United States, and over here, the pile of all the clothes that say made in China, on your blouse or your pants or your gloves or whatever. You all know what the result is. The pile from China would be high, and the pile from the United States low. And half of those that say United States, it's lying anyway. Well, retailers have long understood, particularly in certain parts of the country, that if you change the label from made in China to made in the United States, you sell twice as many. Right? Okay, so here's the thing. If we actually carry this policy through, Mr. Trump's, and we hit them with a tariff that drives up the price of your underpants, you know what the working class in this country is going to do? It's going to have to demand higher wages because it's going to have the money to buy something other than from China, which is a lot more expensive. And that's taken 30 years to develop all of that. American capitalists don't want an angry working class demanding higher pay so they can buy underpants. The American capitalist wants them to be equipped with cheap underpants. You understand? So today, right now, as we're talking, there is a highest level delegation that can be made of the United States Chamber of Commerce. It's in Beijing begging the Chinese government to cut a deal, to stop this crazy business. They are, the Chamber of Commerce, the enemy of Mr. Trump. And everybody, many Americans don't know this, but I didn't make it up. Go Google the Chamber of Commerce, you'll read about the delegate, because it's not a secret, but it is something that we don't look at. Well, I want you to think about it. Here's the second interaction, just as important. Because the American working class has become the consumer of Chinese goods, the flow of dollars, US currency, to China to pay for the underpants and the toaster and the car is much larger, ready, than the flow of Chinese money here. We buy from them way more than they buy from us. Well, you know what that does? That builds up a load of dollars in China that have nothing, they don't come back because the Chinese don't need them or want them because they're not buying that much from us. What do the Chinese do with all the dollars coming in? If you're a Chinese producer of underpants, you get the dollars, you know, millions of dollars, but they're dollars. You can't go into a downtown restaurant in Beijing and have a meal with dollars. So they go to the government bank. This is how finance works. And they translate, to cash in the dollars for Chinese currency, which is what they do business in. Which means the government, which runs these banks, is now accumulating an enormous hoard, ready, of dollars. But that's useless. So what does the Chinese government do for 40 years? It turns around and takes the dollars, for which it has no use, and lends it to the United States government. They buy treasury securities, that's what it's called. The government issues bonds when it borrows. In other words, are you ready? The Chinese government is the largest single creditor of the United States of America. Its money lent to the Treasury helps pay for the losing war in Afghanistan, which the Chinese oppose as they finance it. This is called high finance. You can imagine what low finance is. It also means that the Chinese are in a very powerful position to make life in America very difficult. Why? Because they own all these treasuries. Suppose they decided tomorrow to play real hardball with Mr. Trump. They would start selling them. They would stop buying them. And where is the United States going to find another China to pick it up? There isn't one, which means the United States government would have all kinds of new problems borrowing money. Current deficit of the United States this year, $1 trillion, without which the United States can't function. Oh my goodness. Oh Jesus. We depend on each other. The United States depends on them not cashing in those treasuries. The United States depends on China to keep sending cheap consumer goods. The Chinese, for their part, depend on all kinds of specific things from the United States. They buy components for a lot of their electronic equipment from American companies, for which they have no substitute, would be a real problem. For those of you who know about these things, China is not as far advanced with anti-cancer pharmaceuticals. As a Chinese population gets older, which it is doing quickly, it is having cancer more and more. It needs cancer drugs. If you notice, the Chinese government announced yesterday and this morning that they are taking back some of the tariffs that they had imposed in that tit for tat between them and Trump. Why? Because at the end of this month, they're resuming negotiations. The leading Chinese is, I believe, coming here to Washington to negotiate with Trump. And as a sign of good faith, the Chinese are always doing this. As a sign of good faith, they canceled some of the tariffs. And one of the things they canceled the tariffs on were cancer pharmaceuticals, because they need those. So you have mutual need, but I want to stress to you that the need of the United States for them is, if anything, greater than the other way around. So now we have a clash of two civilizations, but a difficult one because we need each other so badly. And now the last level. The last level is about Mr. Trump's re-election. And for those of you who don't pay attention, let me urge you, virtually everything that is going on now, and surely everything that will go on for the next year, is about that. First and foremost, Mr. Trump wants to be reelected, and he is terrified that he won't be. And Lord knows what he may do if he isn't. He has already several times hinted that he won't go quietly, that he will unleash his followers. He particularly mentions the military and the police, where he has so much support. I mean, you know, the man has verbal diarrhea, but nonetheless, you know, some of it, there's something there. Whatever it is, there's something there. So he's worried. And where does the China war fit in? Two things. Number one, here he is being Mr. America First. Listen to the story. We Americans have been victimized. The Mexicans took advantage of us. The Canadians took advantage of us. The Europeans took advantage of us. The Chinese, even the Indians took advantage of us. To hear him talk, you've got the person who is the perfect victim. Everybody is taking advantage. Who is that talking to? Put aside Mr. Trump, a basket case, that's something else. But who is he tapping into? The American people who feel victimized every which way, in large part because they are. So now he makes a bond. I'm you and you're me, we're victimized, and I'm gonna stand up and stop it. That's what they want. They want their victimization, their lousy wages, their crappy jobs, they're loaded up with debt, all the things that are squeezing them from every side. He is gonna turn that around, and he makes a strong case. I don't wanna go in this direction, but try to compare that bonding with Hillary Clinton. No contest, no contest, none. So he's milking that because it's worked for him. He went from a real estate hustler who lost most of the money his father left him to become the president playing that game. And China is the perfect other. I am going to teach them a lesson. Look at me, America first. They're not going to victimize us. So partly, this is his theater of re-election. That's how he's going to do it. He has to play that. There's only so far you can go calling Mexicans names. It didn't go as well as he had hoped. Even the bashing of the immigrants pretty much played itself out. But this China, which is a big, powerful thing that nobody knows much about, and is conveniently also not white, or at least in the American mentality, not white, is a good target. He is the powerful. But here now comes the contradiction. By slapping them around, his hope was, let me quote to you early on, tariff wars are not a problem. They are easy to win, that's a quote, and it's easy to win quickly. That was early in 2018. Here we are, most of the way through 2019. He hasn't won, and it sure as hell isn't quickly. So he's got a problem. But he can salvage the problem if he has, ready, a dramatic breakthrough. Let's hope maybe late winter, early spring coming, just in time to milk it for all the political juice you can squeeze, sorry for the mixed metaphor, out of this. That would be a great, and portray whatever deal he cuts as a tremendous victory. I mean, knowing him, whatever he does is a tremendous victory. So he will make a tremendous victory that America, all of that. But there's still more contradiction. Why? Because the Chinese are never, ever going to permit, and they don't need to, the United States to dictate to them what kind of economy they have, what pace of growth they're going to have. They're not going to do that. Just like he can jump up and down, say whatever he wants about Hong Kong. The decision about what happens in Hong Kong is going to be made in Beijing and nowhere else. And the rest of the world may not like it. You may not like it. I may not like it. But that's how it is. And there's nothing that's going to change that. The Chinese know it, and they have that strength, the quiet strength of the guy who's got the biggest stick in the room. But here's the contradiction. The longer it drags out, the longer Mr. Trump can't get from the Chinese even the little bit needed to portray himself as a victor, the more damage it does to the economy. And he needs to run as the president in a great economy, but he is undercutting the great economy. So now he's got a, oh my God, what am I going to do now? A recession, if it comes between now and say August of next year, if it comes in the next year, that's his election's over. He's done. He's fine. He's finished. He knows that. What is he going to do? He can't stop the fight with China. He'll look like a loser. But the very fight with China is bringing that recession closer because it's messing up the world economy. So he's got two ways to handle it. Number one, he's got to begin now to blame somebody else for the recession. Who is that? The Federal Reserve. Every day he attacks the Federal Reserve. 2 days ago, they are boneheads. That's an extraordinary label for the head of the financial authority in your society. Boneheads, really. He wants, remember, I already told you, he wants to lower the interest rate, negative interest. He doesn't care. Because what he wants from them is irrelevant. He wants them not to do what he wants them to do so that he can blame them when the recession hits, if it does. He's stuck. He's desperate. If he was willing to bring the Taliban to Camp David in the secrecy of the nighttime, imagine what he would do with the premier in China or with the negotiators in China. You're at a point, again, the metaphor with England, you're at a point of it's all unraveling. The biggest thing Mr. Trump has in this whole crazy China mess, which is one of the reasons he went after China, is he gets no effective opposition from the Democratic Party at all. It's a free shot. The Democrats are still so lost in their history of anti-communism and anti-socialism and anti-China that they have nothing to say. They can't make an analysis. They can't expose anything. They basically want to beat up on China too. Remember Mrs. Clinton? She was interested in making wars here, there, and the next place. What is this? Here's the important, these are fundamental dead ends. In the remaining 2 minutes, gainers and losers. China and the United States are both losing from this war. The silly estimates, which one is losing more? I do a lot of radio and television interviews these days, and I'm constantly asked, which one is losing more? The answer is, nobody knows that. That'll take years of research to try to begin to get an answer to that question, and there'll be lots of disputes about whatever answers are coming up, because it's very difficult to do. So the answer is nobody knows. What we do know is it's bad for the Chinese economy, it's bad for the United States economy, and it continues to be bad. So winners and losers, nah, there's just losers here. This is Mr. Trump's political gambit for re-election, overlaid by people with grandiose notions, like poor Mr. Bolton, who really wants to change, regime change in China, which is crazy stuff, and he's gone, but they probably get another one like it. Trade wars and military wars. The history of capitalism is the history of trade disputes and tariff disputes degenerating into military disputes. If you look at the history before World War I and you look at the history before World War II, there were major clashes among the leading capitalist countries. In those eras, Germany and England were the kind of major ones, but you bring in the other ones, the tendency to go from one to the other when you can't work out your economic problems to resort to a military solution are always in the wings. That's why when you read, some of you do, you'll see that the American Navy has sent ships into the South China Sea. And these are little probings to see what can be done. Very, very dangerous. U.S. isolationism. Yes, there are ideologues here. Mr. Bolton was one of them. They really think that the United States can and should smash the Chinese. And there's two ways to do that. One, military confrontation. Probably the American military has explained to them this is suicide, so don't go there. There are signs that the American military is very standoffish relationship to Trump. You get a lot of that in the European newspapers. Of course, you don't get that here. That's one way. But there's another way, and that's isolationism. Just withdraw. Shut off access of the rest of the world to the United States. Turn inward, close your borders with walls, but literally turn in. Isolationism has been an American idea in the past. In the early part of the 20th century, was very strong. There is this notion we can make it ourselves. The rest of the world wouldn't be a threat to us if we hadn't leaked our secrets, our technology. It's that kind of American superiority mentality. And if we shut down, if we don't give them, if we tell Huawei and every other company like that, you can't have our technology, well, then they'll all disintegrate. It's a little bit like when I go to seminars about the Chinese economic development and I try to point out what it's been doing. My colleagues who love capitalism explained to me, oh yes, the Chinese have been growing very nicely, but that's because they allowed private capitalism. In other words, they live in a syllogistic world. If there's good news, it's capitalism. If there's bad news, it's something else. And the whole world is organized. But you stop talking to that person because it's having a conversation with cement. Gets boring after a while. And now finally the election. The key point about the election. Mr. Trump has to resolve this crazy crap, or else he's done. If a recession comes, and that's the biggest problem he has right now, his biggest risk, that's in his mind, he looks at the Democratic candidates and he can't decide which one of them will be better for him to run against. You all have to understand, he sees them all as arriving with big burdens. And this may come as a surprise to you. The two he's probably most worried about are Sanders and Warren. And so you may begin to see, there are already some signs that this is going to shape up to be his biggest worry. But he's not really worried much about them. He's worried about, above all, a recession. Remember, the recession is what brought in his great nemesis, Obama. The collapse of the economy in 2007 and 8, at the end of George Bush's term, created the groundswell, in his mind, and for many people, the groundswell that swept Obama into office. He knows that. Everything he does is anti-Obama, as you all know. So for him, the nightmare is to have happened to him what happened to George Bush, so the next Obama can arrive or something like that. So the recession is the problem, and here's the final thing for tonight. Is a recession coming? The answer to that question in capitalism is always the same. Yes. No, I mean that. Capitalism is 300 or 400 years old. It started in Britain, it spread to Europe, from there to North America, Japan, and eventually the whole world. Wherever capitalism settled, wherever, and became the dominant system, you had an economic downturn every 4 to 7 years. It's the average. Every economic historian knows it. It's been a terrible problem for capitalism from the beginning. Other systems had downturns, but they had one of two explanations. Nature, it rained too much, it rained too little, the soil got exhausted. So other economic systems have had downturns if nature turned against them. And the other big cause, war. If you have war, it really messes up your economy. And capitalism has suffered from natural problems and war. But capitalism has a new additional thing. Every 4 to 7 years, with or without nature, with or without war, we have a downturn. A downturn, a recession, a depression, a cycle, a crisis, a business cycle. You get the picture? Lots of words, because it's always with us. Every 4 to 7 years, boom, millions of people thrown out of work, jobs disappear, businesses go out, bizarre. There's a joke I tell when I teach my classes. I look to my students across the podium and I say to them, if you live with a roommate as unstable as capitalism, you would have moved out years ago. Right? It's an unstable system. It has plagued capitalism. They have tried everything to stop it. They know why. Every 4 to 7 years, you throw people out of work. If that were a random process, that any one of us could be the one on this time. And remember, if between the time you're 20 and the time you're 70, you're going to go through a lot of these every 4 to 7 years. Sooner or later, it's going to get you. And you know what happens then? You lose your money, you lose your savings, you lose your house, your family falls apart. Okay? So if this were a random risk for all the working class, capitalism would be gone. It's unbearable. Not just the happening of it, but the anxiety of fear about it. How do you commit to buying a house paying over 20 years when you could at any time lose it because this crazy instability? So the capitalists have understood that. They've tried to figure it out. In the 1930s, when capitalism really took a dive, the Great Depression, we even had an entirely new economics developed by a very smart British fellow, John Maynard Keynes, designed to figure out why does this happen and what do we do to at least have them less often or not so bad. Nothing works. That's why we just had another one in 2008, proving that all the lessons we learned in the past don't add up to an ability to stop it. So Mr. Trump is advised by people who know, of course there's a recession. Your only hope is this: postpone it. Push it back a few months, 6 months, 9 months, so that you can have the election before it hits, so that Mr. Trump will survive, and on the morning after the election, an advisor will give him that famous remark made by Louis XVI, the 16th king of France. Famous remark: "Après moi, le déluge." After me, it blows up. That's the issue for him. And he is going to play out this game with China, no matter what the cost to the Chinese, or for that matter, to the United States. How far will he go? There is no limit. I'll end with telling you what he has already done. When he started hitting the Chinese with tariffs, they're very smart, and they came back with a tariff, a particular one, on soybeans. The Chinese, as if you know the Chinese diet, they use a lot of soybean oil, they use a lot of soybeans, but a major part of their diet, and they need to import it. They don't make enough of it, they don't grow enough. And the United States had become dependent on China for selling most of the soybeans. And there are several states in the Midwest that depend on soybeans and that voted for Mr. Trump, and who might not, if they can't sell their soybeans. The Chinese hit the soybeans with a tariff so that the cost of American soybeans went up because the importer in China would have to pay the American price plus the tariff that the Chinese government put on. So the Chinese people couldn't afford American soybeans, so they went to Brazil, which is a major producer of soybeans. But the Brazilians are ecstatic. They're excited that they could become, and they are becoming, the #1 supplier for China, the most populous country in the world. And one of the consequences is burning down the Amazon to grow the soybean. You understand the interconnections of the world? Good. How did Mr. Trump now, what did he do? He's in trouble. The farmers in the Midwest that grow soybeans are getting pissed off at him. That's an economic term, pissed off. Okay? Pissed off, but he had a solution. He came up with, ready? $20 billion. He gave them as a gift. He bought their votes. But the best part is, you all, with your taxes, provided him with that money. So he used the taxes we pay to buy the votes his China policy risked losing for him. A man like that, there are no limits to what he will do as he proceeds. And that, in the end, will be the determinant, more than anything else, of what happens in this war with China. As you can see, the Chinese are constantly giving him, making us concessions, hoping to find some way to give him enough to stop this craziness. Whether that works or not, I don't know. Any more than I can tell you whether Boris Johnson, the crazy fellow at the head of the, or maybe, we don't even know, the calls for him to resign. I don't know if you're aware, but there are demonstrations across Britain demanding his, just a footnote. It only took 3 weeks for the British people to get rid of their crazy Trump. Here we are 3 years later, we still can't do it. Tells you something. Folks, we've come to the end.